Good morning, everyone. You can hear me okay? So I'd like to welcome you to Grand Rounds this morning. We have an exciting speaker, an engaging topic. I'll start off with some acknowledgements. First, I'd like to thank AstraZeneca and CMP Pharma for supporting Grand Rounds. Of course, we'll thank the Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation for giving us this forum to reach our wider community. Today's Grand Rounds is part of the MHI and Community Clinic Partnership Initiative. The goal of this initiative is to reduce cardiovascular disparities and to provide access to cardiology care to the communities surrounding Abbott Northwestern Hospital. We realize that education is a very important part of our community outreach, and this includes learning about health disparities, the importance of health equity, and the impact of bias and racism. So I'd also like to thank Abbott Northwestern Hospital Foundation for supporting this work. I would like to acknowledge Sarah Kasperi and Lisa Smith, who not only created the partnership, but also are leading work to build relationships with our community clinic partners in outreach and education. And I'm really delighted to welcome our speaker today. Dr. Quinn Capers is the Roddy P. Cox Professor of Medicine and Associate Dean of Faculty Diversity and the Vice Chair for Diversity for the Department of Medicine at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas. Dr. Capers is widely recognized as an educator, clinician, and a champion of diversity. He's a graduate of Howard University, Ohio State College of Medicine. He trained in internal medicine, cardiology, and interventional cardiology at Emory. Prior to joining the faculty at UT Southwestern, he was at Ohio State University, where he spent 10 years as the Dean of Admissions of the medical school, where the medical school is recognized as one of the most diverse in the country. Dr. Capers studies the presence and extent of unconscious racial bias in medical school admissions. His work has been used by medical schools and graduate medical education leaders to guide efforts to enhance diversity. Among his many honors at Ohio State, he was inducted into the Society of Master Clinicians. He was voted Professor of the Year, and he was inducted into the University Diversity and Inclusion Hall of Fame. Nationally, he is a recipient of the AHA Lennox Clinician Educator Award, the AAMC Exemplary Leadership Award in Diversity and Inclusion, and the ACC's Distinguished Award for Excellence in Diversity and Inclusion. He currently serves as the inaugural chair of the American College of Cardiology's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Dr. Capers has trained thousands of physicians in strategies to reduce the impact of implicit racial bias in patient care and candidate selection. We're very fortunate to have him here in person today, where he'll be speaking on countering the arguments against enhancing diversity in medicine with evidence. Please welcome Dr. Capers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bennett, and thank you, all of you, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be with you here today. Really am enjoying the weather. Dr. Bennett was telling me this is unseasonable, so I'll take it. I'll take credit for it. But I really do appreciate you coming here. And so Dr. Bennett reached out to me on your behalf, and we had some great conversations. And I do appreciate the invitation to talk to you a little bit about diversity. And I want to kind of approach it from making an argument for diversity, or another way to look at it is kind of pushing back against the pushback that we sometimes encounter when we take a stance to enhance diversity. So I've been doing this a long time, talking about diversity and how diversity is a good thing. And as you might imagine, going coast to coast talking about that, occasionally you will get some pushback. People say, well, why? Why? And it's important that we are able to construct a cogent argument. So I've put this together as kind of a way to use evidence to counter the arguments against diversity, but we'll just really talk about a lot of evidence also in favor of diversity. So let me start here. Let's see. I need to point it somewhere in particular.
No, sorry, it should be working. You gotta click on the screen here.
Click here.
Yes. Now let me try it.
Ah, there you go. Okay. So in my travels, and I've been doing this for a long time, I've kind of collected, if you will, arguments against diversity. And I thought I would share some of them with you. So here's one of them. There is a lack of diversity in medicine, but this medical school or residency or fellowship or faculty, this isn't the place to fix it. Go back to kindergarten. You got to go back to kindergarten. Go back to the public school system. That's the place to fix it. That's actually an answer that I got when I, years ago now, wrote ERAS, the Electronic Residency Application Service, and the match, asking them if they would do what the AAMC does. And what you may not know is when someone registers to take the MCAT, the Medical College Admissions Test, you might remember this from back when you took it, you have the option of indicating that you're a member of an underrepresented group. And they then make a list. It's called the MEDMAR. And then medical schools can see that list. So if I'm a medical school, if I'm Quinn Capers University, and I want to try to enhance diversity, I can get access to that list of Black, Hispanic, and Native American people who took the MCAT, and I can send them a nice glossy brochure saying, this is why you should want to apply to my university. So I was asking the match if they could do the same thing with the residency. Those of you who are closer to the match, you know that as a part of applying for the match, you also indicate your race and ethnicity. And I said, well, I wrote them and said, well, can you just make a list that, that we can get access to as programs if we want to increase our diversity? And this was their answer. They said, well, you know, elementary school is really where you need to be working. This is not the place to fix diversity. There's a diversity problem, but this isn't the place to fix it. Another argument is this one. You've probably heard this one. Diversity equals lowering quality. So this one obviously is provocative, but this is an argument that we hear, and we'll talk about that. Another one is this one. The only thing that should count is merit. When you're talking about letting people into medical school or residency or fellowship or recruiting people to your practice, the only thing that should count, the only thing that we should be looking at is merit. Number four, you've probably heard this, patients don't care. Patients don't care about the race of their physician. If you've got a malignant tumor growing in your brain, the skill of the surgeon to be able to dissect that out and preserve your brain function, you don't care about the race, you just want them to be good. You've heard that as well. And you know, this is one I've heard. Well, what about my kid? You're talking about enhancing diversity. What does that leave my granddaughter? What does that leave my grandson? What about my kid? So let's go together on this journey as we try to make counter arguments against some of these arguments. So to fix kindergarten first. So first, I'd like to start here. This national study done at Vanderbilt University, where they looked nationally at gifted and talented programs, which are programs in the public school system where it's kind of the first siphoning off of really high achieving students and getting them on a pathway. So it starts in kindergarten, first and second grade, where students are identified and they get more challenging work, they get a little more attention. And what this study found is that even among students with high standardized test scores, Black students are less likely to be assigned to gifted and talented services, even when you control for other factors, including their standardized test score. So there's a bias in being siphoned off and put with the smart kids, going all the way back to kindergarten. So let's go a little further down the pipeline. This is a study, an interesting one, where the researchers at an education conference, they asked high school counselors to look at transcripts of rising high school seniors and make a recommendation on whether or not they would recommend these students to take advanced placement calculus. Now, if you have children approaching time to apply to college, or if you might even remember yourself, that the more AP courses you have on your transcript, the more attractive you are to colleges. So this is a high stakes game because you can't take the AP course unless your counselor recommends that you take the course. So what they did, the researchers, they made up several fake profiles of rising high school students, high school seniors. Some of them they gave very high academic credentials, like a 4.0. Some of them they gave lower credentials. Some of them they gave ethnic sounding names, like DeAndre Washington and Deja Jackson, and some they gave more mainstream sounding names like Hannah Douglas and Jake Connor. There's a website that can tell you the likelihood of a name belonging to somebody from a certain race, and that's where they got these names. Well, what they found is that Deja Jackson, and if I would have, before this, if I'd have said, close your eyes and I'm going to say a name and you tell me who you imagine. If I'd have said Deja Jackson, there's a good chance you would have said, I think I'm picturing an African-American girl. Deja Jackson was at a particular disadvantage. When she had the highest academic credentials, she was less likely to be referred to take AP Calculus than when Hannah or Jake had lower academic credentials. So just the name, if the name sounds ethnic, the name sounds like they belong to a minority group, that can trigger some of our biases, and this is in high school. And then here, this is an older study, but this one is important because of the way they did it. This was a cohort study where they followed 25,000 children, 25,000 white, black, Asian, and Hispanic children from 8th grade to 12th grade. And every year, they would ask them about their aspirations, particularly aspirations to go to college, aspirations to be a doctor, aspirations to be a lawyer. And they found that by the end of the cohort study, by the 12th grade, it was the black boys and the Hispanic girls who were most likely to drop that aspiration where they had originally intended to go to college or professional school or graduate school. So the constant bias, the constant wearing them down gets to the point where they say, you know, I no longer want to be a doctor. I no longer want to be a lawyer. That's not really realistic. I'd rather do something else. So the counter argument to fix kindergarten first is that there will be no logic in us leaving what I call the end game, recruiting faculty to your institution or recruiting fellows or recruiting residents to say, let's just concentrate on kindergarten. We obviously need to work on both simultaneously. We need to work on kindergarten, so to speak, and the end game at the same time. And we really do need all hands on deck. This one is a little more provocative, even, that diversity equals lowering quality. But the main question here as we construct a counter argument is, how do you define quality? So how do you? So let me ask you, and I won't put you on the line and make you answer out loud, but if you are the director of the residency program and the fellowship program, and you say our goal is to recruit high quality individuals to our fellowship program, what do you mean? What do you mean? And obviously when you talk to them, what it ultimately gets down to when they talk about quality is they usually are talking about the score on some standardized test. Okay. We surveyed cardiology fellowship program directors a couple of years ago, and it came out in this paper in the Journal of the American Heart Association. And what we asked, one of the questions we asked of the nation's cardiology fellowship program directors is we gave them 10 characteristics of cardiology fellowship applicants. And we said, rank them. Rank them according to your top 3. We want to know what are your top 3 considerations on the day you go into that room and you make your rank list. What are the most 3 important? And you can see them there. The first is clinical skills. I don't have any problem with that, and I bet you don't either. But the number 2 consideration was ability to fit in. Ability to fit in. And you see third, research productivity. Now, let your eyes go all the way down to the bottom. And that's where you see diversity, or the ability to enhance cultural competency of the fellowship program. And what I usually like to say is what we probably wouldn't want the rest of the world to know, we'll keep it, it'll be our secret, that evidence of a commitment to society or being a humanitarian, being compassionate, that was second to last, right? So that's second to last on the list of traits and characteristics that we want to see among people that we're training to be cardiologists. So how do you define quality? This is how these fellowship program directors have responded to our survey. This is how they define quality. We wrote this piece really in response to a recent paper that came out by Liao and colleagues that showed that amongst people applying for internal medicine residencies, the ratio of applicants to those who actually got accepted was worse for Blacks and Hispanics than it was for whites. So they are less likely to somehow get over the hump. And so we talked about that, and we talked about what that could be. And we made these statements. The traditional marks of quality or merit that are used, and this is based on not only ours, but other surveys of residency program directors, are USMLE scores, membership in AOA, graduating from a highly ranked and U.S. News and World Report ranking medical school, letters of recommendation, and clerkship grades. All of those, every last one of those, I could take up the rest of the time here, but I could show you evidence that all of those have been shown to put people of color at a disadvantage. There is evidence of racial bias in AOA membership. So, you know, you might think, if you don't know much about how AOA works, that no, it's just you graduate in the top 20% of your class you're in. No, and I don't know if it's 20% or 10%, but whatever that percent is, Your being in that top 10% makes you eligible, and then there's a committee of other AOA members who decide who they invite to be in the organization. Graduating from a highly ranked school, the highest ranked schools tend to not be the most diverse. So if you make, we only want to take fellows who went to a U.S. News and World Report top 10 school, one of your metrics, then that's almost an anti-diversity strategy. Letters of recommendation, there are studies that show using language interpretation that there are fewer superlatives used with people of color. And even clerkship grades. And I'm not talking about the objective part of the clerkship grades, like you take your surgery shelf, that's objective. But the other part of the clerkship grades, like is this student professional? Are they collegial? Did you enjoy having them on service? Research has showed that there's a bias that puts people of color at a disadvantage. So all of the traditional markers of merit, if you ask a program director, what do you value? There's a good chance that they're gonna say these things. But let's move on to a study that was done not too far from here at Northwestern University in Chicago. They looked at chief residents. Now, those of you who've done an internal medicine residency know that the chief internal medicine resident or residents, they're the cream of the crop, right? Those are the people in the class that are considered by the leadership of the program to be, this is the exemplary resident. This is the best one, or two, or three, in terms of collegiality, in terms of leadership, in terms of being a teacher, teaching the interns and students above them. This is, if we've got to depend on somebody, this one is really standing out. So being selected to be chief resident means that you are the cream of the crop. What they did at Northwestern, they looked at 1,300 chief residents at 13 different residencies at Northwestern. And they compared the USMLE, which, as you remember, step one, that's a score, that's a test that you take after your second year of medical school. They looked at those step one scores of those who had been chosen to be chief resident and compared it to those in the rest of the class who weren't chosen to be chief resident. There was no difference. There was no difference. So in other words, the ability of that test to predict who was going to stand out from their peers in terms of patient care, in terms of being a good teacher, in terms of being compassionate, in terms of being a good teamwork, is zero. I mean, it does nothing for you. So how do you define quality? So if you're defining quality by who scored the highest on the test, here's a good example that those who rose to the top in terms of their performance didn't necessarily have the highest test scores. So that diversity equals lowering quality, the counter argument is, well, it depends on how you are defining quality. And we don't have good metrics to define quality. Another counter argument is that beyond an evidence-based threshold, I'm not anti-standardized tests. I mean, if I were the president of a university that graduates architects, and there was some standardized test that showed your aptitude for architecture, I would use that test. But I wouldn't use it solely. It wouldn't be the only thing I use. I would use that along with some other things. Beyond an evidence-based threshold, higher standardized test scores don't really predict a higher quality physician. That's what that chief resident score showed. And what I mean here is if you take somebody who, let's say, scored, let me not use scoring rubrics because they vary, but let's say somebody on their cardiology boards got 80% of the questions right. Is there any evidence that they're going to be a better doctor than somebody who got 75% of the questions right? No. Might mean that they had a little more study time. But it doesn't mean that they're going to be a better doctor, that they're going to take better care of their patients, that their patients are going to have better outcomes. So diversity does not lower quality. There's no evidence for that. It depends on how you are defining quality. If you're defining it as test scores, then you could make that argument. But there is no argument that test scores equates to quality. And if we want to talk about test scores, as I've already shown you, going back to grade school, even when the underrepresented minorities, Hispanics, Blacks, Native Americans, Native Alaskans, Native Pacific Islanders, even when they have the highest standardized test scores, there's still a bias against them. So how about number three? The only thing that should count is merit. That's it. We shouldn't be looking at anything else. We shouldn't be looking at legacy. If your mom or dad went to the school, we shouldn't be looking at what the prestige of the school you went to. The only thing we should look at is merit. This is an argument that we hear quite a bit against diversity. and I just want to show you a few things about how things are being done, some evidence of bias, and that really blows up this argument that it is all about and should be a meritocracy. This is, this is a study where radiology faculty who choose residents for the radiology program participated in the study. There were 51 of them. They took some of these online implicit association tests. And before they participated in the exercise, they took the test. Now, the exercise was they were looking at applications, a full ERAS application for radiology residency programs. And those of you who are involved in this know that a photograph is still a part of the application. When you apply, you upload your photograph. So the researchers mixed up the academic credentials, but some of the applicants, they gave a photograph of someone who looks overweight or obese, and others, they were thin. And here's what they found. They found that despite identical academic credentials, the obese applicants were rated lower than the thin applicants. But the only thing that should count is merit. Here's another example, orthopedic surgery residency interview selection process. In this study, 357 applications for orthopedic surgery residency were reviewed by 14 faculty. These 14 faculty had already reviewed these applications a year prior, where they saw the entire application. And they participated in this study where they then brought back those applications, but this time they redacted certain information from the application, namely the race of the applicant. And they took the photo off. So it was redacted of the photo, name, race, gender, all that was redacted. But remember, they had already reviewed these applications a year earlier, and of course they didn't remember them because it had been a year ago. So the scoring of the applicants was from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most desirable. We should have this person in our residency program. Here's what they found. So first look at the minority column, and the minorities in this study were blacks, whites, Hispanics, and Asians. When you look at their overall score, remember 1 to 10 was the scoring rubric. The minorities, back when the entire application was visible, their average score was 7.44, but when race was redacted, their score actually went up to 7.5. Look at the next column, white. Their score, when the entire application was visible, was more than 8.07. But look what happened when you hid from the reviewer the fact that the applicant was white. Their score went down. Their score went down, suggesting, perhaps, that being white gave a boost. But the only thing that should count is merit. So the counter argument is that the data reveals that that is not the way we are doing things. And this argument is really only brought up when we're talking about enhancing diversity in medicine. That's when people say, well, hold on now, the only thing that should count is merit. But merit, again, is in the eye of the beholder, and there's evidence, as I've just shown you, that there's bias against people who have a name that sounds ethnic, who appear to be overweight or obese, who are not white. There are others. In fact, you might be interested to know there is even a study where it was shown that with the photo on the application, and I know the women will be interested in this, hair length of the women mattered. The women who had longer hair that was shoulder length or more got higher scores than women who had shorter hair for the same academic credentials. But people will argue that the only thing that should count is merit. I believe that the only thing that should count is merit, but that is not what is happening. And because it's not happening, it is harming our efforts to enhance diversity. Patients don't care about the race of the physician. Come on, man, they don't care about, patients don't care, they just want the best. They just want the best. And so that is what we should focus on, bringing in the best. Well, I hope many of you have had a chance to read this, what really is a very important paper by Marsala Alsan, where what they did in the series of primary care clinics in Oakland, California, is they actually had physicians, black men, white men, and Asian men treating black male patients, and they randomized them. And when those black male patients arrived, all of the physicians in their one-on-one encounters said, today you should get a glucose evaluation, a cholesterol evaluation, and a flu shot. They also wrote a progress note. The end result of the study, you'll see here, that the black men were more likely to get all three, a finger stick for diabetes, a finger stick for cholesterol, and a flu shot if it was recommended by a black male physician as opposed to a white male or an Asian male physician. But what maybe gave a hint of what was happening there is the researchers went back and looked at the progress notes. And the progress notes that the white and Asian physicians wrote about their black patients were very, very short and succinct. Some of them were one-word progress notes. One progress note was simply obese. Another one was simply TB test. That was the entire progress note. When they looked at the progress notes that the black physicians wrote, they were longer and they were more likely to take into account things like the social determinants of health. One said this man needs food, clothing, shelter, and a job. And maybe that level of engagement had something to do with whether or not the patients would comply with the flu shot. Another study done in 2020 by Saha used more visual aids. So these are standardized patients, actors, playing the role of who? Us, cardiologists. They're playing the role of cardiologists. And as you see, there are men, women, blacks, and whites. And they all read an identical script. And the script said, I've looked at your test results. I recommend that you have open heart surgery. The viewers of the videos were actual patients. So they actually rounded up heart patients and had them look at these videos. And they asked those who looked at the videos, now every patient only saw one. We saw one video. They asked him, well, based on what you see, would you have the open heart surgery? And the results showed that the black patients were more likely to agree to open heart surgery if recommended by the black versus the white physician, even when they were reading it in the same way. You know, these are professional actors, so it's not like some of them read it in a very staid way and some were more warm. They all read it the same way. Here's another study. This is now real life, not a simulation. Cancer doctors participated in this study, and they took the online black-white implicit association test, which is a test that can uncover if, unbeknownst to you, you might have an unconscious racial bias for either whites or blacks, or the test could show that you're neutral. So these oncologists took this test. They didn't went about their business seeing their patients, and over several weeks, they saw over 100 black patients. The office visits, with the consent of the patient and the doctor, the office visits were videotaped and graded by neutral observers. Here's what they found, a couple of important things. One, they found that the doctors who had a test result that is called implicit white race preference, which means if I have that, that means I associate a white face with good things, family, joy, love, etc. And I associate a black face with negative things, pain, fear, violence, danger, misery, etc. If the doctor had implicit white race preference, first of all, the duration of their office visit with the black patients was shorter than with their white patients. Second finding was if that doctor had implicit white race preference, their communication style with the black patients was different. It was more of what we call verbal dominance, which means I'm doing all the talking. This is what you have. This is what we're going to do. See you next time. As opposed to when they talked to the white patients, it was much more, well, what do you think? What questions do you have? Do you understand what I just said? Can you repeat it back to me? That kind of, the way that we teach our trainees, this is how you should talk to patients. So I've just showed you data that minority patients are more likely to get a flu vaccination, and you could just, if you wanted to, substitute COVID vaccination, that they are more likely to have open heart surgery when recommended, if recommended by somebody that shares their culture. And I've just shown you that it's possible that if we have an unconscious bias against the patient that we are, the group of the patient that we're interacting with, we're not as humanistic and compassionate in that interaction. So, so the counter argument to this, patients don't care about the race of the physician. They just want the best. They may not care, but that's probably because they don't know all the stuff I just showed you. If they knew that, do you think they would care? Would you care? I mean, imagine that you're the patient. Would you care if I told you that a doctor sharing your culture will probably spend more time with you, will probably look you in the eye more, will probably smile more, and will probably take the time to make sure you understand more? If I told you that, would you care? So they might care if they knew. And then number 5, you know, Minnesota Heart Institute, I don't know what to say about this. Well, what about my kid? Sometimes my energy wanes, so I don't have the energy to take this one on, but maybe I'll let you take this one on. But I figured, I gave you some evidence to fight back against the first 4. The biggest counter argument we have, and the best way to approach this, is to make the argument for diversity. So now I want to spend some time doing that. So I'm on Twitter, and Twitter is interesting for a couple of reasons. There are a couple of really cool things you can do. One thing you can do is on Twitter you can create a poll. And so I made this poll question not too long ago, and I said, please answer honestly, thoughtfully. Here's a statement. If a colleague asked me, why do we need more diversity in medicine, I would have a strong, evidence-supported answer. And I gave them the poll. And as you can see, 75% said either strongly agree or agree. But the quarter said, I don't think I would be able to. And it got some interesting responses. So this one I'm sharing, this is my pal, Carl. Carl's a pulmonologist in Ohio. And he said, I put disagree because while I agree with the premise, I don't have the data really to make that argument. And this person said the same thing. I definitely support diversity, but I lack the knowledge of the evidence to make my argument. And essentially a lot of people said that. They said, I'm with the idea, but if somebody really jammed me up and said, show me the evidence, I don't know that I have the evidence to make that argument. And so we all need to know what that evidence is so we can help make that argument. So I'll put this in the form of a multiple choice question. So this is a multiple choice question, and this is the single best answer type multiple choice question. The question is, why do we seek diversity in medicine? Now, as you know, because you wouldn't be here if you weren't good test takers, you know that the best way to approach a multiple choice question is to cross out the incorrect answers first until you're left with 1 or 2 that might be a possibility. Then you kind of got to use your noggin to figure out what that is. So multiple choice question, why do we seek diversity in medicine? Single best answer. So as I take you through the next few slides, your job is to cross out what is incorrect until we're left with the obvious correct answer. So is it because A, physicians who train in diverse environments rate themselves as more comfortable treating minority patients? Or B, because underrepresented minority physicians are more likely to serve the underserved, and we think that's a very lofty goal. Maybe it's C, minority patients are more likely to follow the recommendations of minority physicians. Maybe it's D, diversity will help reduce racial healthcare disparities. Or maybe it's E, research related. The diversity on research teams will enhance the impact of research. Now, your job is to cross out the incorrect statements until you're left with the one obvious answer. Let me give you some background information. This is a study published in 2008 where they looked at medical students about to graduate and become physicians. And they asked them questions about how they feel, their own comfort treating patients who belong to a group, race, ethnicity, religion, other than their own. They got the answers, and then they looked at the diversity in the student bodies where they attended medical school, and they saw a relationship. They saw that the more diverse the school they attended, the more comfortable they were with treating diverse patients. And so the comments and the conclusion was that in this cohort of more than 20,000 graduating medical students, white students, yep, the purpose of the study was to see how white students feel. White students who attended more racially diverse schools rated themselves as better prepared than students at less diverse schools to care for racial and ethnic minority patients. So maybe you feel good about one of the options. But let me give you some more data. I set out with a goal for this slide and I fell short. What I wanted to do on this slide was put every study that has ever shown that doctors from Hispanic, African American, Native American backgrounds are more likely than doctors from other groups to serve underserved and disadvantaged communities. I fell short of that goal because the slide wasn't big enough. So you'll have to settle for these 10 studies from 4 different decades, all showing the same thing. The jury is in. There is no doubt about it. People who come from underserved backgrounds want to go back and serve the underserved. And here's an interesting way that shows how it might all be playing out. This is a AAMC study. Now, what you might remember, if you're a physician, and you might not remember, is that your first week of medical school, during orientation week, you sat down and you took a survey from the AAMC. I'm sure you don't remember because there was a lot going on orientation week. You also might not remember that your graduation week, your senior year, you sat down and took another survey. But there was a lot going on that week, and so you probably don't remember that. But AAMC has been doing this for many, many decades. Well, one of the questions they ask is this: do you plan to locate your practice in an underserved area? And this analysis of 80,000 students that were asked this question at both the entry to medical school and graduation from medical school, they had some interesting findings. The Black and Hispanic students were more likely to answer yes than the white and Asian students upon entry into medical school. But there were some students, there was a number that were undecided, because it could be, the answers are yes, no, undecided. Black and Hispanic students that were initially undecided, by graduation, they were more likely to answer yes. White and Asian students that were initially undecided, by graduation, they were more likely to answer no. So, the jury is in. People from underserved backgrounds, minority backgrounds, they come into medical school, but that is a part of their mission. And so if it's important to us as a country to have doctors who are serving the underserved, then we know who we need to be bringing in. Now this, I've already shown you this, so you know that whether it's blood tests or vaccinations or open heart surgery, minority patients are more likely to say yes to the recommendation when it's given by a minority physician. Racial healthcare disparities in coronary interventions, in heart transplants, in placement of automatic implantable cardioverter defibrillators are replete. Studies are replete in the medical literature. In fact, what I'm trying to show you here is that 4 decades, these papers started to appear in the 1990s, showing racial disparities in cardiovascular care with regards to heart attack care, heart failure care, and receiving devices, all the way until this year, 4 decades. And when we wrote this review paper, we found that in a 20-year period, there were 300 papers showing racial disparities, that blacks and Hispanics are less likely to get quality care than whites. 300 studies, and things were just as bad at the end of that period and documenting the problem 300 times as they were at the beginning of that period and documenting problems for 300 times. There's something else that is naggingly persistent in cardiology along with those healthcare disparities, and that's this: the severe lack of diversity that we have in cardiology. According to the latest US Census, 51% of adults in America are women. So women, you outnumber us now, 51%. But only 13% of cardiologists are women. 17% of Americans identify as Hispanic, but only 5% of cardiologists are. And while 13 to 14% of Americans are Black or African American, not even 3% of cardiologists are Black or African American. There are many, and you can count me in this number, who think that those racial healthcare disparities that have been persistent, we're not going to really move the needle with those until we move the needle with this and have more diversity in cardiology. Here's a paper where the scientists had an interesting approach. They were interested to see if diversity on the research team, racial and ethnic diversity, had anything to do with the outcome of the research. So they analyzed a lot of papers. That's a lot of reading, huh? 9 million papers. And they studied the relationship between the research impact, which they defined as the number of times the paper was cited. And you know, if you're in here and you're a researcher, one of the most important things to you is somebody going to see your work? You want your work to be cited. So they called that impact. And what they found was that while diversity of institution and diversity of age mattered a little bit, racial and ethnic diversity on the research team was a very strong predictor of impact, or the number of citations of the research paper. So if you're a researcher and you want your research to be cited, you want it to be impactful, then you want some diversity on your research team. So, are you ready? You're all good test takers. Remember, your goal is to cross out the incorrect answers until you're left with the one. What's the answer? I knew you were good test takers. Yep. And so you're absolutely right. The answer is all of the above. So I spent some time showing you counter arguments against those who argue against diversity, and now I've shown you how to make the argument for diversity. And now I want to spend the last 5 minutes talking about what we can do. So what can we do to enhance diversity in medicine? We've got to do several things. One, recruit, and I mean, we need to go deep, deep in the pipeline. Remember, I showed you high school students who initially are saying in the 8th grade they want to be a doctor. By the 12th grade, they're saying, I no longer want to be a doctor. Somehow we're taking that out of them. So when we recruit, we can't just be recruiting college students to come into medical school. We've got to go back, way back, the deep pipeline. But the immediate pipeline is also important. We've got to find that bias. There's bias in the selection process. We've got to find it, identify it courageously, and then address it. And we've got to elevate diversity competency. Remember I showed you that cardiology fellowship program directors, that for them, diversity was the last thing on their mind when they are deciding on their rank list. We've got to elevate that, maybe not to number 1, but at least maybe have it in the top 3. And then we've got to speak out. Our young people are watching us. We've got to be an activist against structural and societal bias and racism and the adverse impact of some of these social determinants of health. So recruit from the deep pipeline. I bet this slide I'm going to show you now is the cutest slide you're going to see all day. Take a look there. This is the white coat ceremony of kindergartners at Ohio State University and Columbus City Schools K-12 Health Sciences Academy. These kids from kindergarten through the 12th grade are going to have the health sciences introduced into their curriculum. And once a quarter, they are going to meet with nurses, dentists, pharmacists, and doctors. And I think by the time they get to be a senior in high school, the idea of being a doctor to them is going to be, it's no big deal. I've been seeing doctors and nurses and pharmacists my whole life, and I know a little bit about health sciences. These are the kinds of things that we have to do. Recruit also from the immediate pipeline. So I'm proud to serve as the chair of the American College of Cardiology's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and one of the projects that I'm most proud of is our internal medicine mentoring program. So we have 3 cohorts of groups very underrepresented in cardiology: women, Hispanics, and African Americans. These are internal medicine residents that we have in a program where we hook them up with an ACC mentor that they talk to quarterly. Twice a year, they get to hear from cardiology fellowship program directors, and we bring them to ACC. So this is one of my favorite pictures. Behind me, you see 400 women, Hispanic, and African American internal medicine residents who aspire to be cardiologists. We're trying to change the face of cardiology. This is the immediate pipeline, though. These are internal medicine residents. They had to get through a lot just to get to this point. But our goal is to make them competitive cardiology fellowship applicants. If you are a member of ACC, or if you're not a member of ACC and you would like to participate as a mentor, please let me know. We need mentors, and we're about to launch our applications for our second cohort. So if you have internal medicine residents here who aspire to be cardiologists, please have them apply for that. We have to identify and mitigate bias in medicine in the selection processes. We did an experiment at Ohio State where we had our entire 140-member medical school admissions committee take several of these online implicit association tests. We found that the majority, more than 50% of the admissions committee, had implicit white race preference. I explained to you what that means. Also, an implicit negative bias against members of the LGBTQ community, and an unconscious bias that man equals career person and woman equals homemaker. And this is the group of people that decides who gets to be a doctor and who doesn't. That is what some call the bad news of this experiment. The good news is, as soon as we got that information and we started training our admissions committee in bias mitigation, the very next class that we admitted was the most diverse class in the history of the Ohio State University College of Medicine. So now we make annual bias mitigation training a requirement at Ohio State University, and we think the same thing should be, we're now doing it, I'm at UT Southwestern, we're doing this for our faculty search committees. And we should be doing it on our residency and fellowship selection committees as well. Bias and equity teaching rounds, we started this program where, much like a morbidity and mortality conference, we take our internal medicine grand rounds and we discuss instances in the last 3 months where people are concerned that bias or racism might have affected patient care, or maybe somebody had a microaggression, maybe somebody heard the doctor say something derogatory about a patient's family member, and we take those instances, we de-identify them, and we turn them into a learning opportunity. What was meant here? Was this bias? Did this bias harm the patient? What can we do in the future to make sure this doesn't happen again? We hope this catches on. We have to elevate diversity competency to a top consideration when making recruitment decisions. In this position paper we wrote called Black Lives Matter and the Cath Lab 2, we talked about a program we had at Interventional Cardiology Fellowship Selection when I was the program director at Ohio State University. We selected our residents, our interventional cardiology fellows, with a simple point score system. We had 5 things that we rated them on: clinical skills, collegiality, academic curiosity, leadership potential, and the ability that they would enhance the cultural competency of the program. Each of those were rated equally, equal weight. And so what did we do? How did we do that? We rated things like, have you had experience caring for underserved populations? Have you ever done scholarly work in the area of health equity? Have you ever submerged yourself in a group of people who are unlike you? And when you use this and you give equal weight to these things, that gives you the power to make changes. As a result, using this system, 8 years in a row, at least one of our interventional cardiology fellows was from an underrepresented minority group. So these are the things that we can do and have been successful in enhancing diversity in medicine. But let's talk about social determinants of health, which you know so well. And I want you to imagine again that you're a child that wants to be a doctor. You're a child that wants to be a doctor. But every 3 years, your family moves to a different apartment. Hunger is something that you struggle with on a daily basis. Your schools are underfunded and overcrowded, and your family's transportation is unreliable, so you can't do that after-school program where you buttress your science knowledge. So those same social determinants of health are social determinants of success in terms of progressing to be a doctor. So we have to be an activist. We have to speak out against these things, whether it's taking a knee for George Floyd, whether it's taking it to the street to try to change the mind of the state legislature, whether it's using revolutionary art, or finally, register to vote, like these medical students at UT Southwestern or at Parkland Hospital, registering patients and their family members to vote. That is how we can overcome these social determinants of health and social determinants of success. So in conclusion, there are many arguments against enhancing diversity in medicine, but they really don't stand up to the evidence. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence in the other direction that enhancing diversity in medicine will be good for all of us and help with our patient care and with our research, care of our underserved communities, and finally, health equity for all. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Great talk. We have time for some questions.
Thank you.
Thanks for an outstanding presentation. You know, one of the things that I think is a challenge or can be a challenge in this space is it's easy to imagine that the people that most need to hear this are the people that are least likely to come to a lecture. And I'm not trying to throw my shoulder out of joint patting myself in the back for being here. But how do you reach out to people that may not be as receptive to this message?
Yeah, it's such a great point, and you're absolutely right. And so one thing that we do that I think is helpful is now, and if any of you are invited to give grand rounds in internal medicine at UT Southwestern, you'll notice this. Now we ask all grand round speakers of our internal medicine grand rounds, no matter what your topic, we want you to introduce diversity, equity, and inclusion in your grand rounds. Give us 3 slides. I don't care what you're talking about. You might be talking about pulmonary hypertension, you might be talking about congenital heart disease, you might be talking about the new gene that you just sequenced that has something to do with regulation of myocardial cell apoptosis, whatever it is. We want you to give us 3 slides in there. That way, it's almost it's always a part of the daily conversation. Because you're right, when there's 1 or 2 diversity grand rounds a year, when people see this week coming up, diversity. I'm not going to that. But ask everybody, because they're really, this permeates everything. And so that's one way to get out of it. One way to get at making sure you're not only preaching to the choir. And the other thing that we found to be important is, just like the presence of leaders here today, is when the leaders send the invitation out to the entire department. So when the department chair or the dean of the medical school says, there's a really important lecture this week or an important workshop, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be there sitting right up front. That is kind of some subtle pressure for other people to say, well, maybe I should be there too, because the dean's going to be looking around to see who else is there, or the chair, or the division chief, et cetera. So hopefully those are some things that are helpful. But you're right, preaching to the choir is a big problem here. I imagine this is the choir, and that's why you came out.
Thank you for coming up to Minnesota and taking a chance on the weather. It seems that cardiology is a particularly undiverse subspecialty, and I just wonder what since you are a cardiologist, what your perspective is on that, not just for African American, but women and Hispanic as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. So we've done a lot of surveys of internal medicine residents, and we're getting some insight about that from both medical students and internal medicine residents. If we take women, and we've had several publications on this in just the last few years, women internal medicine residents tell us that the specialty does not feel particularly welcoming to them, warming to them, that they have very few role models, and that the specialty still has this perception of being, you're working 18 hours a day and you have no time for a life outside of cardiology, which is not true. It's true for some cardiologists, but it's not necessarily true. But we haven't done a good job of letting women internal medicine residents know that. Minorities tell us again that it feels very much like a white male club, and that they're not welcome. So that means that we have got to do more outreach, and that's what we're trying to do.
Is there data between private practice and academic universities in terms of hiring practice or even patient care?
So the question is about private practice versus academics. So both are non-diverse. I mean, that's just how cardiology is. I've not seen direct comparisons about patient outcomes, but we assume that the same things hold. That if you enhance diversity, more underserved patients will get good care, and that it enhances everybody's cultural competency.
We have a few online questions. First of all, Dr. Capers, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
The question is about student loans and funding, essentially. And the question is, are non-white medical students more likely to be receiving federal and/or state loans whose repayment is partially dependent on serving in underserved areas? Do you have any information about that?
I do not, and I don't know that I can speak intelligently upon that, but I do know that I am a fan of programs that say, if you will, we'll pay your medical school tuition if you'll spend some years in this underserved area. Whether or not more underrepresented minorities take advantage of those programs or not, I don't have that data.
So thank you for that. And a follow-up question to that is, after these loans are repaid, and you may not have any information on this, by those students who are serving in underserved areas, do you know whether or not they wish to stay in those underserved areas, whether they're white or non-white?
So that's a very good follow-up question. What I do know is that a lot of these programs struggle with retention, with keeping these people here. And so it does wind up, in some cases, in many cases, almost a revolving door. So I get into this relationship with the state, and they say, we're going to pay your medical school tuition. As payback for that, after you finish your residency, you're going to practice in this very underserved area for 4 years. Very often what happens is that as soon as that 4th year is up, they're out of there.
It's good to see you, Alex Yandigo. I wanted to follow up on Dr. Ekman's comment, and just if you can elaborate further on what the societies, our cardiology societies are doing. I can speak from personal experience that having followed your training through the SkyElm, I thought that was pretty transformative. So wondering to the point of how to make this accessible to everybody, whether there needs to be some regular curricula from the societal level.
Well, thank you, and good to see you too. And thank you for the question. So there are a lot that societies can do. Society of Cardiology, Angiography and Interventions, the Heart Failure Society Association. I just showed you something that the American College of Cardiology is doing because they have the platform, they have the resources, and they've got the captive audience, right? I mean, once a year, you got all of these very smart people converging. So having a curriculum at the societal level with even credentials that you get for, like I've been through bias mitigation training, or I've been through something that shows me how to deal with microaggressions. I think is an excellent idea, and we encourage more and more of that. And we'll be pulling together all the heart societies, SCI, HFSA, NASP, to kind of talk about some of these things. We call it the Heart Summit. But I think the societies really have a good platform for doing good diversity, equity, inclusion, advocacy work. And then in our programs, there's been a call in our residency and fellowship programs to add to the curriculum the impact of bias and racism on health and how diversity can actually make things better. Mostly.
So you spoke a lot about recruitment. Can you talk a little bit about efforts to retain both faculty and trainees that are minority once they're in programs and in jobs?
Yes. So the question was about retention, which is so very important because you can do a fantastic job of recruiting women cardiologists and minority cardiologists, but if they don't feel valued, if they don't feel respected, then it'll be a revolving door. They'll be leaving. So I always say that it's D and I, or you can add as many other letters in there as you want to, but the inclusion is just as important as diversity. You got to make people feel welcome. And so what that means is that your processes for, say, in an academic medical center being promoted from assistant to associate to full professor need to be equitable. And if there's bias in that, you need to identify it and root it out. Certainly your pay, you need to have pay equity. And in your leadership, you need to see some equity in terms of people who are leading the organization. So if you've got, there are some institutions I've been at that they could say, oh, we've got a lot of women faculty in this department. But the chair of the department and the vice chair and the 3 associate vice chairs and the division chiefs are all men. So, and all the women, I noticed, tend to be entry level. So what's happening there? That means those entry level women are staying, they're grinding it out for a little bit, and they're seeing there's no pathway for me, and then they're leaving. So the other part of that is making sure there's an equity of opportunity. And when people feel valued and like, if I work hard, I'm going to be rewarded, that's when they stay.
I ask one more? So you gave us so many reasons of the right reasons to have a more diverse practice group and invite patients in. But at the end of the day, right or wrong, money talks, right? And if we're trying to get the health system to come along, is there data that shows that being more diverse and inclusive also increases market share or the outcomes of the health system?
Well, what a great question. There certainly is in non-medical industries. So in the business industries, they've known for quite some time that diversity of, let's say, the board, the leadership of a business, actually enhances the bottom line. When they have more diversity, more women, more minorities as leaders in the business, they actually make more money because they have more innovative ideas. I haven't seen that same kind of data in medicine and health systems, but and it's hard to see since so very often, of course, hospitals are going to be nonprofit. They're not like IBM. They're not trying to make a profit. But one thing that I think is clear is that you do have to make an investment. I know you're talking about money on the other side, like how much you reap, but actually you have to make that investment for these kinds of things to work. So I just want to take the time to say that. I'm surprised when I see that an institution, and this happens so very often, when an academic institution or a teaching institution or a research-based institution like yours says, we want to be tops in research, they will funnel millions of dollars into the research effort. When they say we want to be tops in clinical care, they will funnel millions of dollars into clinical care. And then they say we want to be a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then they'll ask people to volunteer to work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you've got to spend the money if you really want to make a difference. Yep. Yep. Hi.
Steve Bradley is
Hey,
great to have
Steve.
you here. I had the opportunity to meet Mel Nichols this past week, who I think is following your footsteps. It's just fantastic that these cohorts of folks, you mentioned a fourth cohort of LGBTQ that's coming along in this next
Yes.
cohort, and that's just fantastic. I just wanted to follow up on that comment because I think there's this common misperception that this is a zero-sum game. And this is an opportunity where, as a result of actually improving, you actually float all boats and you improve everything for everyone, including the financial and health of your institution. So this concept that because you're investing in diversity, equity, inclusion, you're somehow not doing something else, and it's a trade-off, I think is part of the challenge that we get into.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.